There are no agenda updates. With that, I'll ask the clerk to call the roll, please.
Mr. Fellers.
Here.
Mr. Fiducia.
Here.
Mr. Gurl.
Present.
Mrs. Gorel.
Present.
Mr. Hoffman.
Present.
Mr. Kelly.
Here.
Mr. McDonald.
Present.
Mr. Neighbors.
Present.
Mrs. Red.
Present.
Mr. Salgado.
Present.
Mr. Schultz.
Here.
Mr. Tassoni.
Present.
Mr. Webster.
Here.
Mr. Westcott.
Present.
Mr. Arena.
Here.
Mr. Billich. Absent. Mr. Booker.
Present.
Mr. Boomer. Mr. Butita. Absent. Mrs. Crosby.
Here.
18 present, 2 absent, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you very much, Clerk Gumma. With that, I will ask everybody to stand for the invocation and pledge, and I'll turn things over to Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker.
Heavenly Father, we thank you for this glorious day that you've made. We thank you for the food to nourish us, the clothing and shelter to sustain us. Heavenly Father, we ask for your abundant blessings on us as we make the difficult decisions that we need to make for our community that we serve. Father, we ask for your shield of protection for our men and women that serve in the armed forces. Father, we ask for your shield of protection for our men and women that serve in our local police and fire departments. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much, Mr. Booker. We do have, under public comments, we do have a speaker this evening. I'll ask Deborah Wilson to please join us. Is Deborah here? Come on up here, Deborah. Thank you for joining us. As Deborah's coming up, I'll read the disclaimer. Comments shall be limited to 3 minutes. Speakers may not address a zoning matter which is pending before the ZBA, zoning committee, or county board. Personnel matters or pending or threatening litigation may not be addressed in open session. Individual may speak a maximum of 3 times per calendar year on the same topic. The prohibition shall include the repetition of the same topic in a statement of what is purported to be a different topic. Personal attacks and inappropriate language of any sort will not be tolerated. We have Deborah here tonight to talk about semi-trucks on South Bend Road, and thank you very much for coming to talk to the board.
Thank you, and I'm about as nervous as you could be, let me tell you. Never done this before, so I'm here to talk about the semis that are going down a posted road. They're going to the Pinnacle Logistics, which is the Amazon Prime facility. The Beltline Road is what they're supposed to be taking. When they come off of 39, they're hitting Beltline, they're turning, and their GPS, because I stopped a trucker and asked him why he was on our road. He said the GPS was taking him that way. There's a sign posted. I had talked to Mr. Kelly quite a few times, and there's a sign posted now, a little bitty blue sign. I have pictures here if anybody wants to see them afterwards. Conditions of the road. The posting of the road that says there's a weight limit, you can only go so far. Once they turn onto South Bend Road, which is, okay, here's how it goes. Baxter, you got Beltline that goes to the facility. Then it's Beltline, if you turn left, it turns into South Bend Road without you even knowing it, okay? There's a trucking company or a railroad company down there where they load railroad cars and stuff. After that point, there can be no semis after there. That's where the posted road stops. Once they turn on that road, there's nowhere for them to turn around and go back if they realize that they're now on a road they're not supposed to be on. There's just no place for them to go. They've tore up the roads down there. It's narrow, it's rough. I asked the semi driver, I said, how do you feel about this road? And he said, it is god awful, because it is. We have school buses that go down there. I drive for Stillman Valley. We're off on the side of the road trying to pass the semi, or the semi's off, letting the bus pass. It's just a mess. When you come out of the terminal of Amazon, there's a sign that just says to 251 to turn on Beltline. It says absolutely nothing about Highway 39 or Interstate 39, which is, I'm sure, where all of them are wanting to go. So to me, the easy fix is just signage. There just needs to be signs. This one little pinnacle sign here, there should be a big sign that says all semis, you know, road posted to the left, or something simple for anyone to be able to see. The condition of the road is terrible. In front of my house, you'll see where it's all busted up there. They've patched it a couple times. There's no weight limit sign if you're coming out of Pinnacle and they're on Kishwaukee Road. Now they've passed Beltline where they should have turned. Now they're coming down to South Bend, which is up across the river. There's no sign there if they turn to the west stating that there's a weighted road there. There is one going west, there's not one going east. That would be an easy fix. And I've talked to Sergeant Boucher. I guess he was new doing the Tough Mudder thing this year, so he was directing traffic. All semis, every semi that came over 251 went in front of our house. I mean, that whole weekend, there was just semi after semi after semi. And there was a lot of them, I guess, that had stopped and asked Deputy Murphy, are you sure you want us to turn this way? And he said, this is the way you've been directed. But I guess in Sergeant Boucher's defense, it was his first year doing all this, and he had told him if anybody had stopped, which I guess I wasn't the only one that talked to Sergeant or Deputy Murphy. There was a lot of other people that stopped to complain about all the semi usage there. So he was making note to let Sergeant Boucher know about that for next year, because they should have all been just directed down 251 to Airport Drive, and they should have went through the airport to get wherever they needed to go. So most of the truckers at that time were aware that they were driving on a road they shouldn't have been driving on. So, and tickets. Why? I mean, we've been calling for months. I think we started, my neighbor Barb that's here with me, she calls Mr. Kelly, where's the police? If they know this is a problem, why aren't these people being ticketed? You know, I mean, you'll see them. I had to stop at the end of my driveway today because now it's not just Amazon and it's Schneider trucks. I see Walmart trucks that says Walmart on the side. So it's not just, now it's not just Amazon anymore. Before it was.
So, Mrs. Wilson, we're at the 3-minute mark, but you raise a good point. I'm sure the board is going to want to see some type of follow-up, and if it'll work for the board and this will work for you, on your way out, I'm going to have you connect with the gentleman in the gray suit, has my haircut in the back there, and I'm going to have him get your contact information.
Okay.
He can speak, maybe he's our highway director, Joe Vanderwerth, and he could, at least from his perspective, look at the signage, or at least advise on the signage. We can't speak directly to the enforcement piece, but we can follow up and just put this on the sheriff's radar as well.
Okay.
Because those are two different things, but thank you very much.
You want me to
coming.
leave these someplace?
Yeah, and we'll pass those around to the board
Okay.
so they see those. And thank you very, very much for your time, ma'am.
Thank you very much.
Yes, Joe?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to add for the board's edification that this came to Public Works some time ago, and we took the unusual move, and the reason I say it's unusual is because we put up signs directing people where to go to get to Prime, and we don't do that anywhere else in the county. We don't normally advertise wayfinding signs for private businesses. So the GPS thing, there might be some ways we can deal with that. We'll take a look at that, but we have had put out as much effort as we could trying to get these trucks to go on the right road, and we just haven't been able to get rid of the issue. And part of it, I think, lies with Prime in directing their drivers where they should be going. So we're following up with that right now, but I'd be happy to take this lady's information and see what we can do, what else we can do, and get back to her on that.
Thank you, Joe. And I think she stepped out in the hallway with Mark Carner. Maybe you want to grab a pen and connect with her there. Thank you very much for that update. And thank you, Deborah, again. We'll move on to our next item of business, board member correspondence. Any comments by board members? Mr. Webster.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. I'm looking at this email thread between yourself and Mr. Westcott. I think you're probably aware of what I'm talking about. I'm wondering if you wanted to comment about that.
I'm not sure what email thread you're speaking of.
It's about the appointment to the Housing Authority Board. And it appears that you are asking, or you have selected a person to replace Mr. Westcott. And I'm just kind of surprised or appalled, really, that you would want to replace someone who has a 19-year track record of nothing but successes with the Housing Authority. 19 years of accolades. We are highest rated in the nation for the types of things that our Winnebago County Housing Authority does. And Mr. Westcott was there to shepherd this stuff through for 19 years, and I'm a little miffed about that. I wondered if you would comment on that.
Yes, since this is board member correspondence, I won't take a lot of time. I'll probably refrain from having commentary on that until we get to the appointment section of the agenda, but I'll absolutely address that, and I do appreciate you bringing that up. Any other questions or comments by board members? Seeing none, we'll move on to chairman's report. Yes, we'll mention for the record that Mr. Billick has arrived for the meeting, so we'll mark him as present. Under chairman's report, just a couple of quick items. There's been a discussion with the Cherry Valley TIF in reporting on that. That has kind of vacillated and gone back and forth with some of our partners over several months. And now that Mr. Chapman is in, I believe he's taking a look at that. But I just want to put it on the record that there's been a long-standing TIF district and also a reporting mechanism, and there's some discussion around that. I do know some of the partners are talking and have opinions on that, and we just want to close the loop. There will be an update as soon as we have one, but we want to give Steve a little bit of time to wrap his arms around it, work with State's Attorney's Office, and come to conclusion. The next item, Project X, I'm not being cryptic, but I kind of have to be cryptic, is there's a project that is in the very, very early stages out related to I-39 that I just wanted to put on your radar. There's initial, very preliminary discussion. I do not have a lot of detail because it has not been shared with me. Just want to put on the record, there's a discussion that if it gets legs and substance to it, I have talked to Mr. Billick offline and Steve Chapman offline and John Gilberti. If we get any substance or momentum on this will come forward for a little more substantive discussion. But just there's some rumblings. Maybe it's good, maybe it fizzles. I don't know at this point. With that, we can move along to the announcements and communications. Clerk Emma.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The items listed below were received as correspondence.
And we'll place those on file. Thank you very much. Next item on the agenda, number 10, the consent agenda, and includes, I believe, 4 items. The raffle report, the bills, the approval of the August 22nd minutes, and the layover of the September 5th, 2019 minutes. May I please have a motion? Mr. Hoffman on the motion, Mr. Fellers on the second. Any discussion on the consent agenda, A through D? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? Motion passes. Thank you very much. County Administrator's report. Steve?
I have no report at this time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Steve. And our next is our department head updates. Obviously, many of you have seen the news with our local school district. 205 has had some significant IT challenges, and I can't speak to that as eloquently as I'm sure Gus can, but did want to have Gus take 5 minutes, come on up and talk to the board, and just talk about our preparedness from, I believe, ransomware or hacks or something that would threaten our system, and just wanted him to, where he's able to publicly share information, give an update, because a lot of public entities are dealing with this issue, and it raises concerns anytime something like this is in the media. District 205 is not the only local entity to have this issue in the last 12 to 18 months. So, Gus, thanks for coming in to give us some of your time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, County Board members. Thank you, Mr. Chapman. I've prepared a few statements for this evening and to give you an idea of our circumstances in the county regarding cybersecurity, but also nationwide. It does not matter if it's an organized crime cyber gang looking to make money with ransomware, state-sponsored cyber teams stealing data and creating denial of service, or malicious individuals trying to impress others in the hacker community. Threat actors are smarter than they ever have been, and they are better furnished than ever to inflict disaster. Not only are they smarter, cybercrime is commercialized. You can find on the clear net and the dark net, usually at a price, appropriate mechanisms to activate ransomware, phishing expeditions, denial of service, and other things that corrupt business activities and government activities. No longer is it necessary to write clever programs or use brute force computing to compromise an individual computer, network, or organization. It can be done with anyone who can turn on a computer. While ransomware attacks are demanding extortion payments in cyber currency, it may be more lucrative for a threat actor to operate surreptitiously inside a network and use the computing power of the organization to mine cryptocurrency or participate in cyber espionage. Hackers will focus on end devices, desktops, laptops, tablets, smartphones, printers, and the growing field of the Internet of Things. The threat is not restricted to Windows operating systems. It's Androids, NICs, style operating systems, iOS, and embedded manufacturing operating systems. Anybody wearing a Fitbit, anybody wearing an Apple phone. These things all connect to a network. Networks are the vectors to allow malicious malware to enter into network. Phishing schemes continue to be the most lucrative method to penetrate an organization. These are the emails we receive that look legitimate and entice us to click on a link or take an action. In the last 24 months, 394 ransomware attacks have occurred against government entities in this country. Since January 2019, 500 K through 12 schools have experienced a ransomware attack. In June of this year, Lake City, Florida paid $485,000 in ransom, and the city of Riviera Beach paid $600,000. Over $18 million in repairs has been spent so far with this year's attack on the city of Baltimore. Ransom still in progress, and recall that the city of Baltimore was also hit in 2018. Atlanta, Mecklenburg County, Lake County, Indiana, Augusta, Albany, Jackson County, Georgia, and the list goes on and on. 63% of all ransomware attack subjects are hit a second time. The names of some ransomware software include CryptoLocker, WannaCry, Bad Rabbit, Cerber, Crisis, CryptoWall, Jigsaw, and Lowkey. Enough of the threat, it's real. It's been real since the 411s, a group of hackers in Milwaukee in 1983, ranging in age from 16 to 22, penetrated hospitals in this region. And that is when the breaking and entering into computers became a Class X felony, the manipulation of medical records that could result in death. The 411s, the original Teenage Hackers movie, debuted in 2015 at the Sundance Festival. First slide, please. Turn off that light, please. Thank you, Mr. Booker. You mentioned shields. Please recall in the Star Trek series, there was 23rd and 24th century technology, which we're not there yet, was used to protect starships, space stations, and small planets from a degree of danger. It was referred to as shields. Shields were not intended to protect against all threats. And as I recall, the very last release of the Starship Enterprise was destroyed by Klingons breaching security, the so-called two-legged predators. Next slide, please. In our case, this is an overview of what we call the Winnebago County Metropolitan Area Network. In our case, the shields are characterized as apparatus with rubrics such as antivirus, awareness, web filtering, spam filters, firewalls, zero-day threat protection. The aggregate of these devices reduce, the key word, the threat incidents mentioned earlier. We cannot guarantee that there will never be an incident at the county. A big enough hammer can break anything. In the last year, in the last 12 months, we have averaged 1 threat daily that has been neutralized in our network, and 1 virus cleanup weekly in a laboratory-style setting. We take computers offline, absent the environment. 77% of all the mail received by our mail servers delivered to our county are knocked down as being hazardous. 77% of the mail received by the county are knocked down as hazardous. We put forth a 5-year IT capital plan in fiscal year 2019 as well as in fiscal year 2020, whereas next-gen security acquisition, firewall replacements, off-site data storage, and other technology enhancements for our cybersecurity posture and computing stability. Key expression, computing stability. We, county government, we have historically, and I hope we will continue, to not whistle by the graveyard of cybersecurity threats. We do our best. I can't guarantee, and we were asked today by the Register Star, when in the last several years have we been attacked by ransomware? That answer is none. But I also didn't disclose any of our mechanisms. Why don't we want to do that? The threat actors like to know exactly what we're doing inside. So I can't guarantee we'll never be breached, but we do everything in our power to keep it that way. And we do have a personal security and cyberspace brochure at wincoil.us that's intended for use by us as individuals on how to behave and how to use things like LastPass and KeyPass so that we're not exposing our passwords. My bet is many of us in this room have received an email that says, "Hi, this is the password I have on you." And it might have been a password that you used 15 years ago. Please remember, LinkedIn was hacked in 2017, and guess what was exposed? Passwords. They store them in clear text. Facebook was hacked. Facebook is pretty much hacked every day. And the passwords that we have there are rendered. And so if there's anything I can leave here with you tonight is 2 things. Use a different password for every place you're enrolled, a different password every place you're enrolled, and then don't click. If that email looks suspicious, just delete it. And if there's a link in it, don't click it. And we have a campaign in the county, and folks hear me say at the end of every business meeting I'm in, "Oh, by the way, don't click." And some of my associates here could confirm that. In the back, there's some of our staff that execute the processes we need to keep those firewalls and those zero-day threat protection and antiviruses operating, and we do it holistically. We're not perfect, and I get uncomfortable talking about this because it's much like when we say I haven't had a cold in 2 years, and then we get one. My basement's never flooded, and then we get home and it is. And so there's both good news and cautious news. We keep what we have with vigilance. We watch, we watch, we watch. We monitor our security activities and we take action. That's all.
Thank you very, very much, Gus. I know a couple hands popped up. I got Mrs. Red, then Mr. Fellers. Mrs. Red.
Thank you, Chairman. Gus, if your email is found on the dark web, what does that mean?
If your email's found there, that's just a mechanisms for threat actors to impersonate. And since you've asked that question about dark web, I do want to make a comment on clear and dark. The way to think about the dark web is an upside down iceberg. Most of the websites are above the water line. Today, there's approximately 35,000 websites on the dark web. And are there nefarious things happening? Absolutely. But there's nefarious things happening on the clear web. So if your email is out there, the way it got out there, when the hacker took all the LinkedIn passwords, what they did is go to the dark web to sell them. There is a market for selling email and password combinations, and especially if they're fresh. If anybody uses Lookout on their phone to protect it, you will find the breaches of the most recent. So I hope that answers your question. Our email addresses are out there in public land. That means my gusgettner@gmail.com, my gusgettner@hotmail.com. The likelihood I'm going to get a hazardous email is high. You know, the same thing with gus@wingoil.us. But back to phishing is still the most lucrative. If you can entice someone to click a link, and especially if it's someone who has elevated privileges in a network, bad things start to happen. Does that help?
Thank you very much, Mrs. Redd. Mr. Fellers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have two things. Do we have a standard compliance or security training platform that all employers are required to go through?
Negative.
We should discuss that.
Onboarded employees do get presented the acceptable use policy, and they sign that.
I just to be clear, if, I work for a tech company, and every year I have to go and get recertified and go through a new training, even though I do it every year for the exact same reasons. And I want to actually add to what you've said about phishing and the level of sophistication, because it's something that I deal with in my job on a day-to-day basis as well. I received an email at my county address the other day from someone named RJ Pittman, asking me to download and comment on this document. Now, RJ is the CEO of the company I work for. So to get that email, someone would have scraped my data from LinkedIn, understood that I worked for a company called Matterport, known who the CEO was, and then hit me on a different email address for that. So this is the level of sophistication. And when it comes to phishing attacks, that is the most common way in. You, me, everyone sitting in this room, we're the weak points in the security chain. So I know I personally always have a policy of being skeptical of just about every email I receive, unless I know 100% for certain it's from someone that I know.
Some of us may know that on Saturday the 6th, we sent an email out to everyone in the county advising to be cautious about emails coming in from educational organizations. We also advised caucus leaders and others about what we think and what we should be cautious of.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fellers. Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Gettner, in the event of a ransomware attack on the county, is our system backed up so that we could recover it without having to pay to one of these bad actors?
That's a great question. So yes, the systems are backed up. There's 5 things a CIO thinks about: keeping systems up, keeping them secure, keeping them backed up and recovered, designing for high availability, and ensuring everything's licensed. We make complete backup of our systems to the 911 center weekly. So there's a backup sitting downtown data center and one up in 911. Are they recoverable? The answer is yes.
So if there's a ransomware attack, we wouldn't be ever be in the situation where we have to pay.
Negative. We look at the cost. We look at the financial cost. We know of plenty of organizations that pay, and it's depending on the size. If we estimate it's $1.7 million to do the recovery, and the ransomware is $57,000 in Bitcoin, it's a business decision. It's a business decision.
I see. All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Arena. Mr. Webster, then Mr. Fellers a second time. Mr. Webster.
Yeah, Gus, I'm admittedly ignorant about how this works with the payoff with this Bitcoin. Isn't there a way that they somehow track who winds up getting this payment somehow? I don't get it.
We're aware that the FBI have made initiatives to try and track the transactions that initiate between starting with legitimate banks like Chase Manhattan and Rockford and making transfers to Long Island City banks. But as it morphs through the Bitcoin into cyber currency, the design of cyber currency is an anonymity. And so having that knowledge, once it transitions into cyber currency, all expectation of identification today is lost. So the answer is no. You can track the physical, for the legitimate banks, you can track from Rockford to Long Island City. Once it transmutes into cyber currency, no longer, because it's not a Dave Tassoni. It's a bunch of characters and numbers that are non-traceable.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. Mr. Fellers on a follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just one quick question on the backups. Is the backup center, backup system, the 911 center, is that air-gapped?
Negative. And we have that in, we put that in the fiscal 19 cap plan as well as 2020 to air gap that.
Sorry, go ahead.
And for clarity for Mr. air gap means that our backups are not physically in Rockford. They're located somewhere else in the country. So our 911 center is in our network. And so the backup is 5.5 miles away. But if that data center was to get contaminated, so the answer is no, and that's what air gap means, having our backups physically separate from our network.
Any follow-ups? I guess I just had one related to budgetary requests in this year, in this fiscal year budget that's before the board tonight, and even last year, things that you've said we need this at some point and maybe we just couldn't get it into the budget. Would you say, could you give a little perspective on things that maybe we'd want to look at in the near future or in the next year or so? Just a quick 30-second to a minute narrative on budget impact on our ability to execute here.
Well, I think I'll make some comments historically, but Mr. Chapman over the years has definitely listened to our calls about the devices we need to put in our network and how we need to do things. And in our if a fiscal year 2020 IT capital plan was adopted, there's a half a dozen must-do things that we should do. One is called firewall replacements because they're coming to end of life. One of them is called off-site backups for the gap, creating the gap. Another one is called next-gen security. Another one is called developing our internal network into what's called a gigabit 21st century network. And another one has to do with the volume of PCs that we have in the environment that are obsolete. Obsolete computers are a threat. Windows 7 is a threat. Windows 8 is a threat. And so there's a half a dozen things or so that are must-do, but it's not inexpensive. I think earlier this year there was a cap plan that was presented and then it was sent back to be studied. Does that help?
Yes, and just to follow up on that, then in the fiscal year 20 budget, the things you requested in the cap plan are in the budget before the board tonight?
Negative.
Or are not in the budget?
That's separate and distinct from the county looking at a holistic capital plan for county government.
I just wanted that to be clear since it was referenced in the near future. And what is the amount of that when we get to it? Ballpark, roughly?
It's millions.
Okay. Okay, any other questions for Gus? Okay, thank you very much for giving us some
Thank
time.
you for your time. Thank you for allowing me to be here.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Next item of business, standing committee reports, Finance Committee, Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Finance Committee has 16 items tonight before you. Some of them can be lumped and be here for the first reading. So the first one is Budget Amendment 2019-032, Kids Place, to be laid over. And I would like to motion to suspend the rules and take a vote on it today.
We have a motion by Mr. Salgado on Budget Amendment 2019-032, Kids Place, to be laid over, or I'm sorry, we're going to motion to suspend as a separate action. Second by Mr. Hoffman, Mr. Boomer, and Mr. Girl, thank you. So we have a motion and a second to suspend the rules, which would then separately allow us to vote this evening on the Kids Place budget amendment. Any discussion on the motion to suspend the rules? Seeing none, all those in favor of suspending the rules signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? We've unanimously suspended the rules. Thank you very much, Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to move to approve Budget Amendment 2019-032, Kids Place.
We've got a motion by Mr. Salgado on the Kids Place budget amendment, a second by Mr. Hoffman. Mr. Girl, thank you very much. This item is now before the board for action, or discussion before action. Any questions, comments by board members on this budget amendment related to Kids Place? Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is just a transfer of money from one to another. It's a neutral.
Yes, that is correct. So the reason is the Kids Place will need additional funds to finish off, and juror expenses are expected to be less, so that's where the money's coming from. So essentially, it's just a transfer between the two.
Thank you.
Thank you for clarifying that for the record. Any other questions, comments by board members? Since this is a budget amendment, are there any board members who are opposed to this motion? Please raise your hand. Since no hands are raised, we will cast a yes vote for all members present. Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much, Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The next item is our fiscal year 2020 budget that was laid over on September 5th, and so I move to bring it to discussion.
We got a motion by Mr. Salgado on the fiscal year 2020 budget that was laid over from September 5th, 2019. We have a motion to approve that budget. May I have a second? Second by Mr. Girl, thank you. The 2020 budget is now before the board for discussion and comments before action. Go ahead.
Yes.
We'll go to the chair of the committee.
Prior to that, if I'm not mistaken, there's an item, number 4, amendments. So I'd like to amendments to fiscal year 2020 budget. So I'd like to motion those in. Those were passed in the finance, which essentially would change the September 5th to the current one today, which was discussed last meeting. So I'd like to move to actually amend that budget with these amendments that we have here.
Is it this?
Yes.
Okay.
That's part of it, but there were 7 items, I believe, that equated to, let's see here, to actually reduce our budget deficit to 689.
Okay, so let's do this for clarity in the room. If this works for everybody, we'll read in each of the 7.
Sure. Sure.
Go ahead.
Yeah, give me one sec while I get my other one. All right, the first one is the health insurance cost contained. There is no large unpaid claims outstanding. So we reduced that by $725,000. That's the first budget amendment. I don't know if Mr. Kalinkas, as part of Robert's Rules of Order, if we have to do one at a time or we can lump them together.
Take them as a whole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My recommendation was going to be, unless you're going to anticipate, and anybody from the board floor can ask for that, but certainly from this procedural point, you should read them all at once.
Sure. And so the second one that we have here is just a levy amount for the IMRF fund can be reduced, and the amount of and be shifted to the general fund by $500,000. So it's just a transfer from IMRF to the general fund. That's one. That's number 2. Number 3 would be the reduced amount budgeted for the contingencies by $400,000 of proposed student loan assistance and $70,000 of other contingency. So the whole amount was $470 was the reduction. The next one is the proposed budget can be reduced for the items based on the actual expenditures of $150,000, which includes the employee parking, the tow, and tax and license fees, which equated to $150,000 in reduction. And then the final one was the 2% reduction in personnel budget in all organizations reflected vacancy, contingency held in departments that do not typically have turnover. That equated to $822,425. And then there's two more. The next one is increased revenue budget for the new growth tax levy, which equated to $194,000. And then the final one that we have here is for the jurors. If you recall, it's to reduce the jurors in the jury commission by $45,000. So that was an attempt by the circuit clerk to say, hey, we found this money that you can reduce that. So that was $45,000. So with all that said and done, everybody got a copy of the memo that was presented in the finance committee that was discussed, which leaves us at a deficit of $689,000 when we make that. So that's where this budget, all these budget amendments is showing reflection that we will be left with a $689,000 deficit. And I know that Mr. Boomer and Mr. Hoffman spoke to prospective county board members on this issue, what direction we were going to go with, obviously not taking the tax levy increase. And so that's from that direction we arrived to this. And obviously the other piece was the revenue projections were higher. We talked about this at the joint, committee meeting, committee board meeting?
Committee of the whole.
Yeah, committee of the whole. We discussed about that. That's the direction. Everybody should have this information. It's just formalizing these budget amendments to reflect the amendment, budgeted amended. So
I'm going to come right back to you, Mr. Salgado. We got a motion by Mr. Salgado on those 7 items, amending the proposed fiscal year 2020 budget. May I get a second to this amendment motion? Second by Mr. Neighbors and a second by Mr. Boomer as well as Mr. Gurl. So we have a motion and a second to amend the fiscal year 2020 budget to include the 7 items Mr. Salgado just shared and read in for the record. We have a motion and a second. Any discussion on this motion to amend? Seeing none, all those in favor of amending the 2020 budget to reflect the items that Mr. Salgado just read in signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Are there any opposed?
No.
Okay, I'll ask for a roll call. Again, we're just amending the budget. This is not the actual vote, but I'm going to ask for a roll call on the motion and a second to amend the fiscal year 2020 budget to reflect the items Mr. Salgado read in. I'll turn it over to the clerk.
Mr. Fiducia? Yes. Mr. Gurl?
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel? Yes. Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
Mr. Kelly?
Yes.
Mr. McDonald?
No.
Mr. Neighbors?
Yes.
Mrs. Rudd? Yes. Mr. Salgado?
Yes.
Mr. Schultz?
Yes.
Mr. Tassoni?
Yes.
Mr. Webster?
Yes.
Mr. Westcott?
No.
Mr. Arena?
Yes.
Mr. Billich?
Yes.
Mr. Booker?
No.
Mr. Boomer?
Yes.
Mr. Butita is absent. Mrs. Crosby? No. Mr. Fellers?
Yes.
Motion passes, 4 noes, 1 absent.
Motion to amend passes. We've amended the fiscal year 2020 budget to reflect the 7 items that Mr. Salgado read in. The item is now motioned and seconded. We have an amended budget before the board, as just voted by the board, before you for discussion and questions. Any questions or comments on the amended fiscal year 2020 budget? Mr. Gurl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just so that we're clear and everyone knows, the 689 deficit, that will be coming from our general fund reserves. Is that correct, Mr. Salgado?
At this point in time, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gurl. Mr. Fellers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just to be clear, that 689 deficit, we've not budgeted in any contingency for lawsuits, unexpected expenses, or anything else like that. As soon as there's another budget amendment, we dip further into reserves. Is that correct?
If the budget amendment comes through and it's voted by the Finance Committee and the board, yes, it would need to. Mr. Chairman, if I may, I have an additional amendment that I'd like to bring as part of this, but I wanted to read those 7 because those were on the packet, but I would like to add an additional one as an amendment. It's not going to decrease the deficit. It's just a shift between funds from the PSST personnel expenses into the general fund. So essentially, and so it's equates to $700,000 shift from the PSST personnel expenses to the general fund, which essentially what it would do, the reason for this is that the ending fund balance reserve for the PSST would be 0, essentially 383 positive versus a negative, which I believe was $377,000. So that's the rationale why I want to bring this amendment. We can talk about it, discuss about it, but I just want to bring that up as well as part of it. It has no bearing whatsoever on actually reducing the deficit, increasing the deficit. It's just a shift between personnel expenses from the PSST to the general fund.
So we have a motion by Mr. Salgado on, and it's this item right here, correct?
Correct.
Which I believe everybody has. We got a motion by Mr. Salgado on the fund transfer of $700,000. I have a second by Mr. Hoffman. The second amendment to the budget, or the amendment to the amendment, is now before the board, and it is a cost-neutral fund transfer, as Mr. Salgado laid out. Any questions or comments on this second amendment? Seeing none, all those in favor of amending the budget to include this $700,000 fund transfer signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed? No. We will cast a no vote for Mr. Schultz. We will cast a yes vote for all other members present, and we have amended the budget a second time to include this fund transfer, this basically line item transfer that is neutral to the budget. I do have a hand. I'm going to come back to you, Mr. Salgado, but I have Mr. Webster first.
Yes, thank you. Following up on what Mr. Girl just said, this $689,000 that's coming from our reserves, I just want to double down on that. Our total reserves are still at $25 or so million. Is that right, Mr. Chapman?
Steve.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe we're looking at a little over $24 million in those two funds.
Okay, and is that still a safe, what we consider our minimal amount that we have to have? We're still above that mark?
Yes.
Thank you.
I think if I could follow up on that very good point Mr. Webster made, the question then is, are we in compliance with our own fund reserve policy?
Yes.
Yes, we are. I believe the policy was 25% of expenditures, and the number that is projected to end up is above that amount.
Thank you. I wanted to be clear with that because obviously I'm not a fan of any deficit spending at all, but as long as we are still protecting our amount of reserves that we have relegated ourselves to having on hand, that makes me feel a little bit more comfortable. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if I may respond.
Yeah, Mr. Webb. Thank you, Mr. Webster. Mr. Salgado.
Yeah, just to clarify, it's $24.3 million, our ending balance, and the required reserves is 21.6. So we're about, I would say, $3 million in that ballpark of that 25%. So we're well above that. But yes, this year we had discussion. We wanted a balanced budget. We tried to do everything we possibly could to address that and to get to that number without making drastic cuts across the board with departments. And so the 7 items that we laid, 8 actually now, that we laid out, obviously gets to that number that we want to get, which leaves us about 700K still in the red that would be eating up into the reserves. So yes, to answer your question, we're aware of it. Finance, directed us. We had tough discussions and trying to negotiate and trying to get to a point where we need to be.
Any other questions on the amended budget that is now before the board? Mr. Fellers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Salgado, obviously we've increased our revenue projections here in the last couple of weeks. Do we have any sort of contingency plan in place, or at least a framework discussed in the event that revenue projections are off or the economy turns south and they're not as rosy as they appear?
Mr. Chapman, if you want to jump in at this time. Once again, we were conservative at the time, and so we would have made drastic cuts at that time as well. At this point in time, we feel confident 100% in our estimation. Could anything happen, another recession or whatever the case may be? Absolutely, emergency. Anything's possible. We're confident to the point where we made a conservative attempt with the forecasting that we did for the last 3 months and projecting out where we're going to be, where we're going to end up being. We wouldn't necessarily, I wouldn't say that we, what we say, play fuzzy math here and just throw out numbers. We actually went through the aspect, well, I didn't, but the staff here with Mr. Chapman and the finance team did so. So to say that, the 1 point, I can't remember exactly the amount of revenue that was increased. Could I say that we have a contingency to cover all that? Absolutely not. Do we have a guarantee that nothing's going to happen? No. Anything can happen at any point in time. But we do feel confident, being conservative of where we stand, that that's a good projection and forecast for that. Now, going forward, we've discussed, I said what I said last time, lack of leadership a little bit on trying to monitor where we're at, what we're trying to do, and forecasting 3-5 years. That's our next goal, to get to what we need to do, so ensure we have metrics out there, create efficiencies throughout the board, eliminate waste. I've gotten a couple emails saying there's a lot of waste out there, please eliminate it instead of raising my taxes or property taxes. So those are the foundations that we're going to continue to do. So I can't guarantee anything, just like Mr. Gus Gettner got up here and said that we have firewall protections and everything, but anything can happen at any time. So we did take the due diligence to be conservative, and we feel those numbers, those projections are pretty accurate at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Salgado. Any other questions, comments by board members? I see a couple of hands up. Mr. McDonald, then Mr. Arena. Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've gotten ourselves down to a $689,000 deficit. We're going the right direction as far as deficit spending. The problem I have, for example, the amendments we made tonight was 2% reduction in personnel. $822,000 total. Well, $430,000 of that comes out of the sheriff's departments. So half of that is affecting the sheriff. Year after year, we continue to have multi-million-dollar cuts to the sheriff's department. It's not sustainable. I've heard some of my fellow board members say that they support public safety but have voted yes to cut the sheriff's department. I don't think that's a fair statement to have, that you support something but you also support cutting the funding for it. I get that we're in a tight spot. Mr. Arena and I spoke today. He sat with the administration looking for where else we could cut to help find some more money to help with the sheriff's department. But I can't support this budget. I'll be voting no tonight because, once again, we cannot continue to cut what is the number one a need for county government is protection. I can't agree with cutting that. Thank you.
One of the things I asked for some feedback or some data on, and I received it from Lisa in finance, and I appreciate her extra time. What was the aggregate amount of new money that will be in the fiscal year 2020 budget in the form of salary increases, whether that's contractual or non-union? And I believe that number, and again, contractually obligated for a good chunk of this money, and then the non-union is not, but it is something that is in the budget, of course. I believe the new money that's coming in for raises year over year is in the range of $1.68 million. And so one of the things when we do have these contractual, we signed the big AFSCME contract this year. There's a lot of dollars that are committed over a multi-year period. These are obviously very complicated discussions, but at the same time, one of the things I asked Lisa for is, well then, if we're at 1.68 of new money coming in next year, what would the year after that and the year after that look like? Because a lot of that's contractually obligated, and we can start planning for it now. It is true that $1.68 million, there's going to be a few people that maybe retire, and we bring in people a little lower on the pay scale, so there's a little bit of offset. So it's not a true 1.68, but it's also not a lot less than that, and it is new money that we need to find year over year within our system at a time when we're taking the new growth, but not the rest of the levy. I know there was some deferred discussions on sales tax and other revenue discussions, but I did want to share that piece of information. And Lisa, thank you for preparing that information. Any other discussion? Yes, I'm sorry, Mr. Arena. Then we have a couple other hands. Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To echo what Mr. McDonald said, I did spend time going through the budget looking for where there might be opportunities to cut. I know that over the first year that I've been a member of this board, I've heard a lot of staff, department heads come in and talk about the trouble they're having retaining employees with where we're currently at. And I appreciate the time that staff spent with me going over it. And at this point, I'm fairly well convinced that there's not a lot of opportunities to cut. I don't think that we can continue with deficit budgets. There's $3 million left in that cushion that we have, and eventually it'll be taken up. And if you can only cut so far. I had reached out to my constituents and got a strong negative response to any type of increase in property taxes, but did get an indication from the people I represent that they would be open to a conversation on the public safety sales tax. I think that is a tax that would be raised by the citizens of Winnebago County through a referendum, so it would be their desire, and I think we need to begin educating the public on our current situation and what the options are moving forward. So I hope that as a board we could take that up in the near future. I will be voting for the budget tonight because I think it's the best situation that we have, and I think Mr. Salgado has done an excellent job putting together the budget that we have before us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Arena. Mr. Girl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Arena could not lead me in any better into this conversation than I was just going to point on. Over the last 10, 12 years, this body has not raised tax levies. We've remained flat. We've left over approximately $25 million out there for the voters to keep in their pockets. We've not really seen that translate into sales tax, new property sales. We saw a small percentage, but not that $25 million actually come back into the board. And if we think about it, in the last 10 years, we've used over $20 million out of our reserves to make ends meet. So if we are going to move into the future and have a balanced budget, we are going to have to increase revenue some way or the other. Property taxes, I have been told by many constituents that they don't want to pay $1 more, even though our little small percentage would be anywhere from $5 to $12 per 100,000 on a home. It's not much. The Rockford Park District takes in more tax dollars than we do as an entity. And we have so much more that we provide. Not saying that the Park District doesn't provide a great service, but we have so much more. So we have to have that conversation about revenue coming up in the future. Whether it's through a public safety sales tax increase, 1/4% would bring in anywhere from $6 to $8 million into our county coffers. That could help with public safety, our courts, our jails, reduce the jail population, reduce the amount of money that we spend, adjudicate cases faster, which would help and save taxpayer dollars. So hopefully this board will have the conversation about putting that out on a referendum question. And we have to think that just under 40% of that public safety sales tax, roughly, comes from people outside of this community. So it doesn't put all the burden on taxpayers. a small burden comes from outside this community. So I think the public safety sales tax is what we should look for to put it on the ballot and let the voters have a say. So that would be my suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gurl, and I believe I had Mr. Fellers and then Mrs. Gorel. Mr. Fellers. Mrs. Gorel?
Thank you, Chairman. I too have been talking to a lot of people about, would you rather us raise the levy a little bit, or should we do some type of a sales tax increase? And when I'm talking to them, Steve, I quote you all the time. We have had a can that we've been kicking down the street. And now it's come to a point that that poor can has gotten kicked so much, it's rusted completely out and has now hit a brick wall. What would you like me to do? And they were saying the same thing. They'd rather go for a sales tax increase than have a levy done. So many of us need to talk to our people and find out what they really want. And I think we can do this and bring this budget where it belongs in the near future and keep it going. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Gorel. And just so I'm clear on the record, obviously new growth is factored into this amended budget, not the rest of the levy, which is the largest chunk. As Mr. Kelly asked at the Committee of the Whole, and just to put on record, it does not reflect, and correct me if I'm wrong, it does not reflect the budget amendment that was for the Sheriff's Department at the end of fiscal year 19. That is not reflected into the fiscal year 20 budget. The other thing I needed to get clarity on for my own, just for the record, and also because it came up at a Finance Committee meeting about 3 or 4 weeks ago, is the commissary fund. My understanding is there was a reduction in the inmate medical. It was a reduction in the inmate medical, but there was something related to the commissary fund, and I just want that explained because that did come up on the floor of Finance. Just what is, because if it's Mr. Chapman or Mr. Salgado or maybe Lisa or Molly, somebody explained the commissary fund shift, just so it's clear and it's on the record and I understand it.
Mr. Chairman, I think you asked the question, and I believe Lisa responded saying that it's in the Sheriff's Department, and they would have to address that. That's what I was.
Is there any other information we could add on I know the inmate medical came up. Is there any clarity we could bring to that?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe the budget decision that was made was to reduce the inmate medical account in the Sheriff's Department by the $1 million on the premise that they were retaining the commission revenue from the tablets for the next year. So that particular item was done as part of this budget.
Okay. Thank you very much. And it was seen, I guess, as an offset of some sort. Any other questions? Anybody's hand up that I missed in questions? Yes, Mr. Fellers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will not be supporting this budget, one, for the situation with budgeting on inmate medical, but also because, as Ms. Gorel said, I think we're kicking this can down the road. I think that the sobering fact is that this has now become a structural issue. As everyone here has said, we've looked for places where we can cut, and there's nowhere else to cut. Short-term revenue, I don't want to rely on, potential tax increases, for whatever they may be to try to find revenue. At this point, I think it is the duty of this board over the next 365 days to seriously look at restructuring this county and rebuilding the way it operates and trying to modernize and make it more efficient. We simply can't operate within the current structure that it is. We need to be looking outside to find new solutions, whether that be through HR, through merging departments and finding cross efficiencies between those groups. In our current set, it's just simply not this current business structure, and there's no doubt that this is a business, we operate as one, is no longer sustainable, and we need to restructure, and we need to restructure fast. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, if I may respond. Yes, I appreciate your comments, Mr. Fellers. I can just tell you that we tried multiple things here, a couple of iterations. It was proposed with the tax levy. We had the 9 items. You know, we talked about the 911, you know, taking that money back for the payment. We put it back on. We put the tax levy back on. You know, we're in this situation, and like I said, you know, if you guys have ideas, I mean, majority, you know, it's not me or Mr. Booker or Mr. Boomer, you know, dictating what direction we go. It's a whole. You know, we came to a consensus, you know, that the majority of the constituents did not want a tax levy increase. We took that into account. We went with it. We did the best we could. We went back. We scrubbed the revenues. We said these are very conservative. We can move the chain a little bit this way, but not this much, to be unrealistic. So we took many iterations. You're absolutely correct. There's a lot of things that we could be doing. And like I mentioned, I feel like I keep repeating myself and reminding everybody else of the same things that we've done. But like I said, you know, there's things that were distractions throughout the year, that were delays in the process. We started up great. You know, the sheriff, I applaud for the sheriff coming through Q1, giving his analysis, his variance analysis between where the spending was, any projects that were going on further. We needed to keep going forward that direction. We stopped. You know, and I said, this is part of my issue, my problem, that, you know, I didn't push a little bit. You're absolutely correct. Those are valid points. But to say, you know, I'm not going to vote for it because these things didn't happen, or it just happened overnight, or the last 2 months, you know, from my perspective, I've been on the phone talking to my caucus leaders, saying, where are we at? How's the sentiment? What do people think? Are there any ideas that we can, you know, maybe make some cuts strategically across the board? Yet to hear one of those comments or addressed to me and say, hey, you know, these are the different ideas that we currently have. But I'm just trying to give a picture to this, that this was a thought out process. It wasn't like we just handpicked numbers out of the air and said, this is what's going to be, and go for it. Strategically, we looked at it as a whole. And so I just want to be clear on that, because I don't want to get the picture that, you know, we're dictating one direction, but this is a whole board that's making a decision here. And listen, we tried to develop with the team of the finance team and Mr. Chapman putting long hours and trying to do projections and responding to everybody's needs and wants. I think this is the most realistic that we can get. And then we just need to move on, like I said. The next thing is, let's start getting into efficiencies, seeing areas that we can go. I know there's been talk about, let's look at Riverhoff, let's look at this area, let's look at that area. Sure. Where were you guys 12 months? The whole thing, you know. Now it's just because we see a deficit, and, you know, we have to take a political stance on one way, whether we want to increase the levy or sales tax, whatever it is. Then, you know, it's like, hold on, let's put the brakes on. So we can all spend time and speculate about revenue. Let's think about now and move forward on what we need to do to ensure we don't get this in the next 12 months, come back here and we're in the same situation.
Thank you, Mr. Salgado. I see a hand up, Mrs. Gorel.
Thank you, Chairman. Seems to me that not too long ago, we had an election where it was voted that we would put together the clerk's office and the recorder of deeds office. No one ever told me how much money we were going to save. Where's that money coming up in our budget? Anywhere? How much money are we saving by combining those two offices? Never did hear a figure on it. Why would we go ahead and do things if no one knows how much we're going to actually recover in income? We can combine everything we want. But if, you know, I want to see the dollars that we would get. Also, I see we may spend a lot of money on consultants. We have people right here in our own county, in our county board, that can be doing a lot of consulting that we don't have to pay out. If you add it all up over a period of time, we have to, in a year, we must be spending at least $1 million, $2 million just on consultants that we don't do anything with. Nor do they improve our situation. We already knew it before they even walked into our front door. So there are places that we don't look, but I don't want ever to see another referendum that I don't know up front when we combine offices, what we're actually going to save besides one person's salary, because that's all I saw that would actually happen And then if that did happen, that is happening, the person who is going to be in charge of both offices will have to hire an assistant so that they have a go-between between the two offices. So we really need to think about what we're saying and what we're looking at and get realistic about this. Like I say, we've been kicking that can around long enough that it's time for us to grow up, get serious, and get these situations taken care of. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We talk about revenue, and I'd like to remind everybody, we have great partners in the county. We all received the email from Judge Doherty, how he felt his department was able to get a $1.5 or $1.7 million grant that went to the general fund, and he felt that he should have a portion of that. I think what we need to do is incentivize people to look for grants and to do positive things, to create revenue for our county that not only funnels back to the general fund, but they're incentivized to help do that. For example, the Sheriff's Department, they brought in over $4.3 million in revenue this past year between federal inmates, fines, bond out. You know, he's generating revenue. That is what we're asking people to do. Instead of just raising property taxes, there are other ways. One thing I learned is if you go to the jail, you have to pay an extra $50 to bond out. But if you go to the clerk's office, they don't charge the $50. So people know, hey, it's $50 cheap if we go this way. That's an opportunity. Maybe we need to charge $50 at both places, or consider, is that a redundancy? We don't have to have the staff to do it both places. But there's things to look at on other ways to be creative with revenue other than just raising property taxes and sales taxes.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. Any other questions, comments by board members? Seeing none, any other comments? Mr. Salgado.
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chapman. Thank you very much. With that, we have twice amended fiscal year 2020 budget to reflect the initial 7 changes that were read in, and then the additional shifting from one fund to the other, or where we would take the dollars from it to the tune of $700,000. So the amended fiscal year 2020 budget that we've just discussed is before the board, and unless there's any questions, we'll ask the clerk to call the roll, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Gurl?
Yes.
Mrs. Gurl?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
Mr. Kelly?
Yes.
Mr. McDonald?
No.
Mr. Neighbors?
Yes.
Mrs. Red?
Yes.
Mr. Salgado?
Yes.
Mr. Schultz? No. Mr. Tassoni?
Yes.
Mr. Webster?
Yes.
Mr. Westcott?
No.
Mr. Arena?
Yes.
Mr. Billich?
No.
Mr. Booker?
No.
Mr. Boomer? Mrs. Crosby?
No.
Mr. Fellers?
No.
Mr. Fiducia?
Yes.
7 noes, 1 absent.
Budget passed. Thank you very much for the discussion. I'll turn things back over to Mr. Salgado, but let's get an official count on that from the clerk when she's done there.
It was 12 ayes, 7 noes, 1 absent.
12 yes, 7 no, 1 absent. Thank you very much, Clerk Elmau. I'll turn things back over to Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our next item is a fiscal year 2020 annual appropriations ordinance, and I so move.
We have a motion by Mr. Salgado on the fiscal year 2020 annual appropriation ordinance. We have a motion. May I have a second, please? Second by Mr. Hoffman. Thank you very much. Item 5, the fiscal year 2020 annual appropriation ordinance before the board with a motion and a second. Any discussion or questions? Seeing none, are there any board members who are opposed to this ordinance? Please raise your hand. Seeing none, we're going to cast a yes vote for all members present. We have passed the fiscal year 2020 annual or appropriations ordinance. Thank you very much, Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so the next piece of it is 6 through 18. I'd like to read them in individually and lay these over, so I go real quickly. Item number 6, tax levy general fund to be laid over. Tax levy county public health fund to be laid over. Tax levy detention home fund to be laid over. Tax levy county highway fund to be laid over. Tax levy county bridge fund to be laid over. Tax levy federal aid match fund to be laid over. Tax levy veterans assistance fund to be laid over. Tax levy tort judgment and liability insurance fund to be laid over. Tax levy Illinois municipal retirement fund to be laid over. Tax levy social security and Medicare fund to be laid over. Tax levy historical museum fund to be laid over. Tax levy county nursing home operations fund to be laid over. Tax levy children's advocacy program project fund to be laid over. And I so move just the first reading.
So we're reading those in, and we have if I understand it right, we have a motion to lay over all of those items, which would be 6 through 18. May I have a second on the motion to lay over? Second by Mr. Gurl and Mrs. Crosby and Mrs. Red.
And we just laid over.
Oh, they're read in, so they will lay over. I'm sorry, I apologize. No action will need to be taken. I apologize, everybody. So we've read them in, and we'll bring those back next board meeting. Mr. Salgado.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That concludes our report.
Thank you very, very much. Nice job. Next item of business, Zoning Committee, Mr. Webster.
Good job. Thank you. Zoning Committee has 2 items on the agenda this evening. The first has been laid over, so it's up for vote tonight. VO 319. That's a variance for a side yard setback. This was read in and laid over. This was in County Board District 18, Dorothy's District. So with that, I would move to approve.
We got a motion by Mr. Webster on Z0319. May I have a second, please? Second by Mr. Fellers. Item is now before the board. Any discussion or questions? Yes, Mrs. Red.
Thank you, Chairman. Last time I laid this over, so I'm asking, because the county is losing money, people are not coming in and getting permits as they should. I'm going to ask that, I'd like to make a motion that this gentleman come in and pay the fee, and we'll go from there.
So the motion, let's get the motion and we'll talk about it. So the motion is to ask the gentleman to come in and pay the fee.
I think she's referring to the building permit, Chairman.
Yes.
Okay, so the motion is to ask the gentleman to come in and pay the building permit, and then what? Then, so until it's paid, it's not passed, or I'm just trying to understand the sequence here.
Until it's paid, it's not passed.
So the motion that Mrs. Red made is to, that approval does not officially happen until the building permit is paid.
Yes.
There's a motion on the floor by Mrs. Red. We got a point of order. I'll allow a point of order by Mr. Salgado.
I'd like to make a motion to send it back to committee and have them, bring it up again. The discussion of that committee to address the issue that
Mrs. Red, would you be okay withdrawing your motion and then we would send it back to committee?
Yes, I'll withdraw the motion and it goes back to.
Okay, so we have we've withdrawn Mrs. Red's motion. We have a motion by Mr. Salgado to refer this back to the zoning committee. So it's a motion by Mr. Salgado to refer this back to Mr. Webster's zoning committee. May I have a second? I see several hands up for a second. Mrs. Red, Mrs. Goro, Mr. Boomer, and Mr. Okay. We have a motion and a second to refer this back to committee. Any discussion before we take the vote to refer this to committee? The first hand up I saw was Mr. Tassoni, then Mr. Neighbors. Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now, I guess my recollection is this variance doesn't have anything to do with the matter of paying for a building permit. It's a variance to whether or not to allow a 3-foot setback instead of a 10-foot setback. I believe it's totally separate from whether or not he pays for a building permit. Mr. Krupp or Mr. Thornbush could speak to that. I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Could we get a little clarity by staff on clarifying this item? You look like you're dreading giving the answer, Troy.
No, thank you, Chairman. Should a variance be approved, they'll have to come in and obtain a building permit. At that time, there's an automatic fee increase since the building was constructed prior to obtaining a building permit. You've already approved in prior ordinances an increase in fees should they get an after-the-fact permit.
Thank you very much. Anything else you want to add there, Chris?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We won't be able to issue a permit until they get a variation unless they knock it down and move it back to the proper setback.
So what I see here is a little bit of a circular
Yeah, so whatever.
chicken and egg.
If it's approved tonight, they will automatically get fined by our fee schedule that's established with work being done without a permit. So they can get fined from a zoning standpoint and then also from a building standpoint for commencing work without a proper permits.
Thank you very much. A follow-up, Mr. Tassoni?
Yes, thank you. Could either Mr. Thornbush or Mr. Krupp give me a detail on what the fees would have been compared to what they may be if this was approved?
Chris?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For an accessory structure, the typical fee is $30. For zoning, it would double, so it would be $60. For building permit, depends on what's in the accessory structure that's being done. It's either $250 or double the cost of the permit, whichever is greater. But that's the cost of the permit's based off of structural, electrical, if there's electrical, plumbing, so forth in there. But typically, it's a $250 fine.
Any follow-up, Mr. Tassoni? Any follow-up, Troy?
Yeah, I have the exact numbers, if that's what you're looking for. If they would have obtained the permit prior to construction, the zoning permit would have been 30. Now it will be increased to 60. If they obtained the building permit prior to construction, it would have been 152. It will now be 304. And if they applied for the variance prior to construction, it would have been 350. And now it was 525. So the initial fees were a totaled 532, and now after the fact permits, it'll be 889. So it's approximately a $300 increase in fees.
Approximately $300 increase in fees. Mr. Tassoni, any follow-ups on your question? Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just in my opinion, the $300-something penalty for what's went on is pretty meaningless to me.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tassoni. I saw a couple. I'm going to defer to the Chair of Zoning. Sounds like he has something he wants to add, and then I'll go. I know there's other hands up. We'll get to everybody. Mr. Webster.
I just want to, I don't know if it's just an admonishment or what. It's just, if people came in and did the right thing first and got a building permit, all of this would be avoided. The building permit would be one-time fee for them, and they would know the rules and regulations about variances and setbacks and heights of structures and so forth. And it all starts with one visit to the department to get a building permit. So without doing that, then people have done and will continue to do this, build structures and so forth without permits, and with any luck, they wind up getting it away with it, so to speak. But in many cases, they get caught up because someone turned them in for not having the proper setbacks or the proper height of a structure or whatever reason, or a fence or something. And that's when they come in after the fact and essentially beg forgiveness. And so now it's in our hands, and so it's up to us basically here to say, okay, we forgive you, pay all this money, and we'll let it slide. Or we say, no, you did that wrong to begin with. Now you need to tear that structure down, or at least a portion of that structure that's infringing in the area where it shouldn't be. So that's where we're at with this. And so all the rest of this, the discussions that we're having here is kind of getting us a little off track about what our duty is here. And that's my personal feeling, so.
Thank you
It
very
would have
much.
been cheaper to begin with for the man to get a building permit, much cheaper.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. I saw a couple hands up now. I'm forgetting who was first, second, third. Mr. Neighbors.
To my understanding, this particular property, it was a shed that was built in the backyard, and it was built by a person who is a builder or supposed to be a contractor. So he should have known to get a permit in the beginning, and he chose not to get a permit. And the reason we know about this is because a neighbor complained about it. So I would move to just disapprove it just because of those two factors.
So right now we have a motion to send back to committee, which if that would fail, then the item would be for the board tonight. So since there's a motion and a second to send to committee, that is the action item before the board right now. If that is voted down by the board, then the item would be before the board for approval or denial. If that's okay, Mr. Neighbors. But that would then, if it goes back to committee, there wouldn't be any action tonight. If it doesn't, you'd have the opportunity to vote as your prerogative, if that's okay. Mr. Fellers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd recommend we not send this back to committee. There's really nothing in committee for us to do with this except for vote on it again and send it back to this board in one form or another. Either we vote it down, vote the movement back to committee, vote down and choose to lay over for any reasons, or vote up or down tonight. Going back to committee is not really going to do anything on this one.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Fellers. I'm seeing hands up. I'm going to go to Mr. Hoffman. I see a few other hands, and I think someone else over here. Mr. Hoffman.
Thank you, Chairman. In my opinion on this, I would be against like saying, okay, pay what you owe and then everything's good. We're setting a bad precedence. So we have other people to consider, the neighbor or whoever it is that the property is too close to. They should have some say in this. We shouldn't be, so I'm thinking that my opinion is we should just vote it down and have them to remove the shed. Because I don't see how it, giving him a chance, or that person a chance to do this is gonna help the situation. It's gonna encourage bad behavior, not stop it. Thanks.
So what you just said, okay, vote it down would be your preference. I see other hands up, and I apologize if I'm going out of order. Mrs. Red, were you next? Mrs. Red?
I don't know, but.
Go ahead.
Get the others.
Mr. Arena?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this conversation started because Mrs. Red had the concern that we would grant the variance and then the person wouldn't pay for the building permit. So if that were to happen, what's the consequence to the homeowner? Say we did approve this and then they never came in and paid any of the money, what would happen next?
Chris?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Code enforcement would send tickets and cite the errors, and then the incompliance with the site, and then they could eventually get a forced appearance at code hearing with more fines.
So it would be all fines, and if they just ignored all that?
In some cases, it'll eventually make it to circuit clerk, and they don't have to get a judge ruling on it, but they would eventually have to pay for a permit to either demo it or get a permit to fall in compliance with the county code.
Okay, so it sounds to me like we have, even if we said tear it down, we would still be in the same situation where, you know, if the person was unresponsive, we would have to go through our system to enforce it. I think on this, I'm going to defer to Mrs. Red. If you're comfortable with the structure staying, then, you know, I would say we approve it. And either way, they're going to have to pay one way or another. But I think since it's your district, I'll follow your lead on where you want this to go. Thank you.
And just to remind the room, right now we have a motion to send this back to committee that we'll have to deal with. Yes vote sends it back to committee, and no vote keeps it right here for action tonight. I know there was another hand or two up. Who held their hand up? Anybody here? Mr. Salgado.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. With all the light of discussion, I'm gonna ask to remove my motion, and so we can vote this up or down.
Can we have a second on that? So, okay, whoever made the second to this was Mrs. Red. You'll be happy to withdraw? So we have a motion and a second to withdraw the motion to send it back to committee. So now we're back here square with the item before the board. A yes vote would pass the item. A no vote would deny the request. Yes, final comment by Mrs. Red.
Thank you, Chairman. This is not the only building in my district. As I ride and look, there are other buildings that have gone up since I've been past some homes. So those numbers will be coming to Chris, and we need to take care of them.
Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much. So the item again before the board, yes vote pass, no vote would deny. Any other quick comments or questions? Yes, Mr. Arena.
Thank you. So, Ms. Red, are you in favor of us passing this?
I want them to come into the county and get the permit and pay the fees. The county is losing money, and we don't need to lose money.
Okay,
So that would be a yes vote?
That would be with what is before the board. If this moves forward, yes, you would have if you vote yes, then it would be for them to be granted this, and in the process that was laid out, that would take care of itself, I guess, as a step 2. Is that correct, Chris? Is that an accurate way to say it? I don't want to misrepresent. Thank you. He's shaking his head yes. So that part would take care of itself.
Tell us so that we all understand. Chris, thank you.
Thank you. If this gets approved tonight, they will be required to come in and pay for the permits to get. By granting it tonight, it doesn't give them a pass on paying for the permits. And the fines will apply to this site.
And how much of that money will go to the county?
All of it goes to the general fund from our permitting.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Red. Thank you, Chris. I saw a hand pop up, Mr. Schultz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know we've beat this sufficiently, but I also think that I've got to echo what Mr. Hoffman said, what Mr. Webster said. This is not about an additional $300. If it costs additional $300 to put something with substantially larger square footage, for example, into an area that they're not supposed to build on, that's not going to matter to people. And if at no point we draw a line and say we actually back up what our ordinance says as it relates to setbacks, then we're sending a clear message to people. Go ahead, build it wherever you want, all the way up to the line if you want, and you'll get forgiveness. Just pay us additional $300.
Thank you, Mr. Schultz. Mrs. Red, we're going to go back to you again.
I think that we need to change that ordinance. We'll let this one slide, and then we'll change the ordinance.
Thank you, Mrs. Red. So we have item V0319 before the board related to the setback. A yes vote would pass, a no vote obviously would deny the request. Any final comments by the chair of the committee? Mr.
Just a
Webster.
reminder, this came with some standard conditions.
Standard conditions, okay. And since I'm not sure which way this one's going, I'm going to ask the clerk to call the roll, please.
And would you like to clarify one last time?
Yes.
Just so that we're clear? What's that? What the vote is?
Yes, V0319, the first item, which is related to the setback, and a yes vote would pass the V0319, and a no vote would deny the request.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mrs. Goro?
I'm going to pass right now.
Okay. Mr. Hoffman?
No.
Mr. Kelly?
No.
Mr. McDonald?
No.
Mr. Neighbors?
No.
Mrs. Rudd? Mr. Salgado?
Yes.
Mr. Schultz?
No.
Mr. Tassoni?
No.
Mr. Webster?
No.
Mr. Westcott?
No.
Mr. Arena?
Yes.
Mr. Billich?
No.
Mr. Booker?
No.
Mr. Boomer? Mrs. Crosby?
No.
Mr. Fellers?
No.
Mr. Fiducia?
Yes.
Mr. Girl?
No.
Mrs. Gorel? Motion fails.
Mhm.
4 yes, 1 absent, 15 noes. 15 noes, 4 yes.
Motion fails. So we will go back to Mr. Webster for the next item. Mr. Webster.
Thank you. Now that we've cleared that up. The second item, and only item I have, is Z0619. This is a map amendment to rezone 0.65 acres from single-family residential in the ag to CN commercial neighborhood. And this one is pretty straightforward, the most straightforward one I've ever seen, actually. And this came out of committee and zoning board of appeals with unanimous approval for both. So this is in for first reading, but I would like to move to suspend because the applicant is asked to do so they can get on with this project that's already been delayed.
We have a motion by Mr. Webster on Z0619 map amendment to rezone, a second by Mr. Fellers. This is a motion to suspend the rules, which would then allow us separately to vote on this evening. A yes vote suspends the rules, and no vote would have it lay over. Any discussion before we take the vote on the motion to suspend the rules? Seeing none, all those in favor of suspending the rules signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed to suspending the rules? Motion passes unanimously. Mr. Webster.
Thank you. Now I would move to approve Z0619.
We got a motion by Mr. Webster on Z0619 map amendment to rezone. May I have a second to approve? Mr. Neighbors, thank you very much. Motion and second to approve Z0619 map amendment. Any discussion by board members on the item before them? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Thank you very much, Mr. Webster.
Thank you. I just want to mention that last one we voted on was the only item on our agenda that took a record of 1 minute and 50 seconds to come to that decision. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Webster. Next item of business, Economic Development Committee, Mr. Billick.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Tonight we just have the reconsideration of the resolution concerning the policy for the process for awarding, recommending, evaluating, and approval of host fee funds to other entities. And I'm looking for a motion to approve that.
Looking for a motion to approve.
I make a motion to approve, sorry.
Oh, we have made a, Mr. Billick made a motion to approve the reconsideration of the host fee policy, or excuse me, the policy for awarding, recommending, evaluating, and approval of host fee funds. May I have a second? Second by Mr. Westcott. Mr. Girl, reconsideration is now before the board. If it's okay, I'd just speak to this really quick about the one issue I have. I don't have a problem with really the policy. I don't have a problem with the idea of having a policy and clarity. Where I'm struggling is when I balance it against the ordinance that this board passed. I'm confused, and the reason I'm confused is the ordinance says that, and it's one of the few remaining duties left to the chairman position, is related to the annual, basically, in being involved with the annual host fee awards. So a host fee award, whether that's going to a public entity, a private entity, or any entity, would involve, based on the ordinance, if I'm responsible for that process in the ordinance, but then in the actual language that I read in the resolution, I don't exist in the process at all. And so I'm just concerned, what I want to avoid is back-end bickering, fighting, confusion, or a dual process where I think something's going on, the board thinks something's going on, because they do not jive, in my opinion, Either I'm responsible for that process or I'm not. And based on the current ordinance, I am. How I understood this, this process is I don't see where I am involved whatsoever in the process. I'm not saying that's the spirit of it. I'm not saying anybody operated bad intent. I'm not saying Mr. Billick and I didn't even have conversations around this. I just brought this back because I'm unclear, and I'm just looking for clarity now or in the future, whether this passes, its reconsideration goes through, or it's not. I just want clarity so that way when we go to deal with a host fee item, I'm clear on lanes as they exist today. We're all clear, and that way we're all focused on the issue, not the process. So that was my one concern, is the conflict with the ordinance. So thank you for hearing that out. And Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I recall correctly, when this reconsideration came up, I thought I looked at the ordinance and it says that it's your duty to monitor the host fee allocations. Is that the language of the ordinance as you remember it?
That very well could be, but it's very specific to the host fee allocation process.
Right. So, I don't know, Mr. Kerlink, am I right? Is that what the duty is, to monitor the host fee allocations of the duty of the chairman is to monitor them? Do you remember?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe the term is monitor. I don't have the ordinance in front of me, but I believe that was the term monitor. I think you're correct, but like I say, I don't have the ordinance, the exact ordinance in front of me.
So not have input, not be involved, but just be aware there's a conversation.
Well, I'm not disputing that, you know, you're bringing up that maybe there's a problem with the ordinance, but I think this necessarily doesn't conflict with that term monitor. That being said, you know, maybe we need to revisit that and clarify what monitor means, but I don't know that it justifies rejecting this because, you know, the chairman's ordinance is unclear on that point.
So as somebody who's not part of the board, I guess this is like I've actually tried to really think this through, and I've talked to a lot of people, and what I get stuck with is I'm not a member of the board. I'm no longer part of the administration. There's no language in the current resolution that anywhere acknowledges monitoring, being aware, being advised of, being looped in on, being part of a conversation, or in any way touching a process related to host fees. But over here, it says in the ordinance, which I think trumps a resolution most of the time, that I'm in monitoring, and even though we might not all be clear on what monitoring means, I guess I wouldn't know tomorrow, nor do I know today, what my role in the process is, and it's happening in different ways so as to not be consistent, so it's even more confusing to me.
And so the solution is to clarify the chairman's ordinance and that term monitor. I don't think the solution is to reject this. So you're making a good point. I'm going to vote to support what we've already passed, but I'm open to conversations to better clarify what your role should be in the process.
Okay. No, I appreciate your comment. Thank you very much. I didn't mean to talk through you. Is there anything you wanted to add, Mr. Billick?
No, just before that, I was going to add, we did, obviously, aside from answering the question, as far as my concern was, ever since we did this policy and spoke about this policy and also the other business policy as well, there was no conversation about changing any role, about anything like that. All the wording that this was actually kept very open as far as just keeping it along with exactly what we have been doing so far. There was no discussion about keeping anybody out or anything like that, or changing anything or anybody's role within this. I do know that it does mention in this particular one that the annual host fee request would usually come through either a county board member or a county board office, which I do believe that's actually in regards to your position as well. And then that would go to the county administrator, which the reason it goes through the county administrator or the county staff is actually for them to draft up what documents we need to actually go forward and vote on, which in here it mentions the county board members only because the county board members vote on it to pass it. I asked legal and everybody else, as far as I know, there was nothing that went against it. If the ordinance, as far as like what Mr. Paul Arena said, if it was something that we need to look back at the chairman's ordinance, I think that's, in regards to that, that's fine. I do know that I asked in regards to this resolution, and this is nothing to change anybody else's role.
Sure. No, and I appreciate that, but the way you just explained it to me, what I'm hearing is a process that does not involve me being part of it, and how can I don't know what, you can define monitor any way. To me, that doesn't jive, but that's okay. At the end of the day, it's the board's decision on this, and I just wanted to bring up the thing, say I'm very open to a discussion on that other end, the ordinance end, as Mr. Arena, just so there's clarity, because it is not clear, and I've asked different people, and it's not clear to them either. That said, I think that if this passes, and it perhaps will, then I'd be very open to clarifying what monitoring means in the current ordinance, short of anything else. Mr. Gurl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I kind of took the words out of my mouth that this ordinance, the host fee policy, I believe is a good step. I think it's what we need. If there is clarification that needs to be made in the ordinance, I think that we need to refer that over to Mr. Fiducia's committee so we can take a look at that ordinance and make sure that it matches up with our host fee policy that we're laying out. A second note, just for the record, a yes vote would reconsider, or a no vote would reconsider? Can you make that
yes
clear,
vote
please?
Thank you, Mr. Gurl. A yes vote would pass item 2 before you and make that permanent. A no vote would reject the item before you. So the item that is before you, the resolution concerning the policy for the process for awarding, recommending, evaluating, and approval of host fee funds, a yes vote would pass that a second time. A no vote would reject that. Anything else, Mr. Gurl? Thank you very much, Mrs. Crosby.
I would like to amend the policy, Exhibit A, third paragraph down, 5 lines into the paragraph, and it says, who will then forward the request to, and this is what I want to add, the county chairman and to the county administrator. And I so move.
So if I understood you right, you wanted to amend the resolution that is before the board to include that requests coming in would include forwarding the request to the administrator and the chairman. Is that correct, Mrs. Crosby?
Correct.
So there is a motion to add the chairman when forwarding requests to include the administrator and the chairman. Is there a second? Second by Mr. Arena. We have a motion and a second. We have a motion and a second. I'll come right to you, Mr. Boomer. Point of order. Yes, Mr. Boomer.
Can you even amend a reconsideration, Mr. State's Attorney, Mr. Klinkus?
Well, why have a reconsideration?
No, the
It's a vote.
resolution that's up for reconsideration is a resolution that was passed and then sent back for reconsideration, so it can't be amended.
Even though it's in the hands of the board.
It can't be amended. The reconsideration is of the resolution that was voted on at the prior board meeting. If you wanted to do that, you would have to, I believe, defeat it and then make a new amendment to the resolution then. But right now, the board has before it the reconsideration, not a new resolution. This is the reconsideration.
Clarification, is that a Robert's Rules point or an ordinance point? Is that, because that's not what our ordinance says, so is it a Robert, are you citing the Robert's Rules? So we can't reconsider, we can't make an amendment to reconsideration?
You can't change something that's up for reconsideration. Reconsideration, you have to read the statute, okay? Reconsideration means that you are reconsidering what was previously passed and then sent back to the board. That's what's before the board, what was sent back to the board, Mr. Chairman. It's not a new resolution.
Well, I know it seems like an eternity ago, but when we had the reconsideration on the Costco vote, I do know we made a small tweak to the actual item the second time through on reconsideration. I absolutely remember that because there was discussion about a certain employment number. We did make that change on the floor that evening when we had that particular reconsideration. Although it was passed by the board, it was passed in an amended state. Because I remember the discussion was on something related to employees or something related to some wording that became particular to that. So that's my distinct recollection. But anyway, That's what we have before the board right now. Any other questions? I see two hands up.
By point of order on this one, I don't think this is correct. I'm reading the ordinance right now. It says it places it back, the original question back on the floor, the slave place that occupied at the original, occupied before being voted upon. So if it sits there at the same place before being voted upon, it can still be amended. It doesn't say in our ordinance that you can't amend it. So that's why I asked if it's a Robert's Rules issue that you're citing, or if it's a point of our ordinance, because our ordinance does not say you cannot amend a reconsideration.
My opinion is that what is before you is the resolution that was passed by the board, was sent back by the chairman for reconsideration. That's what's before you.
So what we'll do, since this involves something that touches me, I'm not going to overrule, although I have the ability as chair to overrule a recommendation by the attorney, I'm not going to do that on the board floor on something that pertains to me, because that looks self-serving and kind of weird. So we will go with the interpretation by the state's attorney, even though I have concerns with it. Mr. Hoffman.
Thank you,
I'm sorry,
Chairman.
Mr. Webster, you're next.
What is the easiest way that we can include the chairman in this without going through a whole bunch of rigmarole? What is the easiest way for us to deal with this?
Sure.
Okay, if I understand what you're saying, right now, what's before you is a reconsideration. If you don't want to pass what you passed before, then you need to defeat the reconsideration and bring back an amended resolution.
Okay.
That's my opinion.
I would then recommend that we do something that, and also follow that with, that we would include the chairman in this process. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Webster. We have a motion to call the question. Do we have a second on the motion to call the question? Second by Mr. Westcott. We have a motion and a second to call the question, which would end debate. All those in favor of calling the question signify by saying aye. Aye. Are there any opposed?
No.
We have a firm no vote by Mr. Fellers, a yes vote for all of the members present. We have suspended, or we have called the question, which will end debate. The item before the board is the reconsideration as passed at the last board meeting of the resolution concerning the policy for awarding, recommending, evaluating, approval of host fees. We have a motion, second, that is before the board. With that, I will ask the clerk to call the roll. A yes vote would pass this a second time. A no vote would not pass the item. Thank you.
Mr. Hoffman?
Yes.
Mr. Kelly?
No.
Mr. McDonald?
Yes.
You got it.
Mr. Neighbors?
No.
Mrs. Red? Mr. Salgado? Mr. Schultz? Mr. Tassoni?
Yes.
Mr. Webster? Mr. Westcott? Mr. Arena?
Yes.
Mr. Billich?
Yes.
Mr. Booker?
No.
Mr. Boomer? Mrs. Crosby?
No.
Mr. Fellers?
No.
Mr. Fiducia? Mr. Gurl?
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel?
Yes.
Mrs. Red?
Yes.
Mr. Hoffman?
I'm going to change my vote to no. I misspoke.
Okay, see, no vote for Mr. Hoffman. Thank you.
Okay, we're moving that one over.
I don't think it matters that it passed.
It passed.
The reconsideration passes, and we'll enact that immediately since it's a reconsideration. Thank you for the discussion. Sorry for the hassle, Mr. Billick.
That concludes our...
Thank you very much, Mr. Billick. Next item of business, Operations Administrative Committee, Mr. McDonald. That was...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Operations Committee's got two items for you this evening. First is a resolution establishing the date, time, and location of each meeting for the Winnebago County Board next year, and I so move.
Got a motion by Mr. McDonald on the resolution establishing the date, time, location of each county board meeting for next year. Second by Mrs. Crosby. Item is now before the board. Any discussion, questions? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes unanimously. Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Next item is a resolution authorizing the chairman of the county board to execute agreements with National Able Network and National Asian Pacific Center on Aging, and I so move.
Got a motion by Mr. McDonald on the resolution related to the National Able Network and National Asian Pacific Center on Aging. May I have a second, please? Second by Mr. Westcott. Mr. Hoffman, thank you very much. Any discussion? Yes, Mr. Schultz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. There are a couple things that concern me about this. It was stated in a couple of different places in the agreement that this entity is the only one who has the authority of either rotating, moving someone out of the position by rotation, or terminating a participant. And there's another statement under the duties, which is the host agency, which would be us, that we would make every endeavor to move this person into a full-time salaried position in available and appropriate openings at the host agency. And so my reason for voting against this is because I think we're putting way too much control related to someone who's working for us, being paid for by this other entity. We're putting way too much control in their hands, and I think that would be disastrous if this person was not a good employee or, you know, there were difficulties with that person.
Thank you for your comment, Mr. Schultz. Was there any discussion on that, or could Steve or somebody speak at all to that at this time? Seeing none, are there any other questions? Or Steve?
There was no discussion at the committee level. This was reviewed by the state's attorney's office, and I believe the county clerk is the individual that was out reviewing these agencies and so.
Okay, thank you. And just so I understand this, and I apologize, I'll just ask that if a person would become our employee, then they would be under our direction and control through our normal organizational chart. If I understand that correctly, there's no reasonable expectation they wouldn't be. If they became an employee of the county, they're an employee of the county the way everyone else is an employee of the county.
They are not an employee of the county.
They would not be an employee of the county, but, okay. Gotcha. Hence the concern by Mr. Schultz. Follow up by Mr. Arena.
So what's the consequence if we do not make every reasonable effort to hire the participant?
That would be, I guess, a question for...
Subject to litigation? I mean, what would that mean?
I'll defer to Mr. Kurlinkus, but I think everything's subject to litigation if there's a disagreement between parties.
I think I'll redefer to Clerk Gummow. I mean, this is a situation where the agency required some kind of written agreement to do this. These are primarily volunteers, correct? Something like that. And they're being provided by these agencies to man the
Information booth.
The booth, right, over in administration.
Anything you would like to add, Clerk Gummow, since this is your item?
Again, I can clarify this. This is so that we can have someone staffed in the information booth, and right now we have no one. And when there's tax payments, we have as many as 100 people an hour coming through the front door. This is an organization that they pay, it is their employee, we provide the supervision. My experience in the past is if it's not a good fit, we call them in, and the rotation is they rotate someone else in. They are generally in the age of 55 to 62, and quite often these are people unable to get positions, other employment, so this helps them sharpen their skills and make them employable to either us or other agencies in the area. So that is why I presented this idea, because again, it is at no cost to the county or liability or taxes. It's an opportunity to place someone who needs a job to assist us in customer service.
Thank you very much, Clerk Gummow. Followed by Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Clerk Gummow, are we able to amend this document and strike the line that's of concern to Mr. Schultz?
We've already had legal review on this, and then they've met with Human Resources, because this position would be hosted technically through the Human Resources Department, not the Clerk's Department, which is why it's coming to the board. And Charlotte Leclerc actually went through it with great detail, and then she met with the host agency representative and with Deb Crozer from Human Resources. And this is their recommendation. Any changes have already been presented. If I'm speaking correctly, Mr. Kurlikis.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Arena. Mrs. Gorel, and a follow-up.
Thank you. If they're hiring people, is it a grant that they're getting to do this? Or where do they get their funds to hire people to do this type of service?
I'll go to Clerk Gummow.
And these are services similar, a lot of times they'll work with unemployment agencies. So again, that they can help give these people, they only work 20 to 25 hours. They're there on a regular basis, unlike our volunteers who sometimes come and go, and we have no control over the volunteers. So again, it's providing them with training and work experience so they can add that to their resume. So again, if we have a position that comes open, then they are more qualified, or if they are also supposed to be looking for employment at the same time, but this helps sharpen their skills and make them more employable in the marketplace.
Thank you very much, Clerk Gummow. I see a hand up. Mr. Schultz on follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is not my intent to undermine a process that helps people. That is not at all my desire, including helping the clerk's office. But what I'm reading here is that we are abdicating control, substantial control, relative to a person that if it wasn't working out, we have our hands tied. That's what this agreement says. So my recommendation would be that we put some language into the agreement that protects us. Doesn't mean that we take complete control, because we can't. We're not paying the person, but gives us an avenue of protection that is not represented in this agreement. So I think that our Assistant State's Attorney is a wonderful person, does an outstanding job, and in this case, I think our interests are not protected.
Regardless of opinion, the board has the authority individually to make a motion to amend this item on the board floor, vote it up or down on the board floor.
I don't agree that amending it is the right pathway. I think this needs to fail, and I think it needs to go back then to the State's Attorney's Office with the concerns that I've represented, with an opportunity to modify the agreement, bring it back to this board for approval in a different format. Because if we start amending this agreement, we're not dealing with the other party. We're just throwing in language, and this is not what we're good at anyway. And it's not something that is vetted by the agency, which needs to happen, so that there's a meeting of the minds and there's a new understanding, and it's a better understanding for everybody involved. Thank you.
We just won't have a person in the commission. That's all.
So if it's voted down, then obviously it could be brought back. The other option, if it's a board prerogative, is to refer it back to for review to the administration and to the clerk and to the state's attorney. Mr. Gurl.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll make that motion to send it back to committee for further consideration.
Would you be amenable to a motion to refer back to
to committee?
The clerk and staff, and then they can do that. We have a motion by Mr. Gurl. Thank you for your flexibility.
I'm sorry, just to follow up, would that not then go back to committee for approval, then back to the board?
The natural state of it is it would go from staff to committee to board, like anything else coming from staff.
So basically, sending it back to committee would ultimately send that back to staff, correct?
Not necessarily. It would go straight to staff. They could do what they do and then bring it to the committee for discussion with.
Then
okay,
let it be, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gurl. Motion by Mr. Gurl to send this to clerk and to staff. Second by Mr. Schultz. Motion a second to send this back to the county clerk and staff for further review. All those in favor of this amendment signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes. We'll send this back to the clerk to make a tweak, and that this will be coming back to committee in the very near future. Thank you very much for the discussion. Mr. McDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I stand up here, I notice yourself and other board members texting. I'm frankly kind of offended by that as the operations chair. I see Mr. Fellers texting. I see yourself texting. I'm hoping we're not texting with one another through here. I'd like to remind everybody that those texts are foiable, and I'd appreciate it if your respect could be with us here tonight. Thank you.
Mr. McDonald will address that.
Sure.
You're welcome to look at any text I've sent. Happy to discuss that over a beer after this meeting.
Respect issues, sir.
Oh, I have a ton of respect for this board. Mr. Tassoni. Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Public Works Committee has 3 items on the agenda tonight. First item is just for read-in only. I'd like it to lay over for a couple of weeks so there can be some discussion. But basically, it's an ordinance establishing speed zones on Argyle Road from Aberdeen Road to Belvedere Road. And like I say, lay over to our next regular scheduled meeting.
We'll lay this over to the next meeting. Thank you very much, Mr. Tassoni.
Next item on the agenda is 19-028. It's a resolution certifying the name to be taken for the examination of our next county engineer, and I so move.
Motion by Mr. Tassoni and a resolution certifying names to take the examination of county engineer. Motion by Mr. Tassoni, second by Mr. Kelly and Mr. Fellers. Item is now before the board. Any discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. Thank you very much, Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Next item is 19-029. It's a resolution authorizing the award of a bid for pavement marking on Perryville Road from Riverside Boulevard to Swanson Road. It's at a cost of $54,550, and I so move.
Motion by Mr. Tassoni and resolution authorizing award of a bid of payment marking on Perryville Road from Riverside Boulevard to Swanson. May I have a second? Second by Mr. Hoffman, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Webster, and Mr. Gurl. Item is now before the board. Any discussion? Yes, Mr. Schultz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question for Joe. In a situation this morning, I'm behind 2 IDOT paint trucks that are going out to paint some roads. And just raised the question because I saw this on the agenda. Do we have the ability to do any kind of coordination where they already have the equipment, they're in Roscoe at the IDOT location there, that's what they were coming from, where they're able to help us with a project like this and potentially reduce the cost?
Joe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is somewhat of an unusual year for us. The paint bids were late this year, and I think most of us as agencies are behind. I know Winnebago County is significantly behind, and we're hopeful that we can get to every road. So I haven't called them. I'd be happy to do so tomorrow and look into it in the future, but as of now, we need a contractor to get it done this year.
Thank you, Joe. Any other follow-ups? Seeing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion passes. Thank you very much, Mr. Tassoni.
Thank you, Chairman. That concludes our report.
Next item of business, Public Safety Committee, Mr. Booker.
Thank you, Chairman. No report.
Thank you very much. Next item of business, Mr. Fiducia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Personnel and Policies has one item. It's a reconsideration of a motion to accept the recommendation of the county administrator to dismiss a county employee, and I so move.
Got a motion by Mr. Fiducia on the reconsideration of a motion to accept the recommendation of the county administrator to dismiss a county employee. May I have a second, please? Second by Mr. Westcott, Boomer, and Gurl. The motion and second brings this item before the board for any discussion. Any discussion? I see Mr. Fellers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually want to make a motion to send this back to committee for a closed session discussion with the state's attorney, given the issues that took place in court today, as well as the action by the previous county administrator to enact the results of this ordinance before it was passed. I want to get an understanding from the state's attorney what our liability is on that. I think that we should proceed slowly. There's no reason why we can't take another 2 weeks, take a look at this, understand what the legal liability is now that actions have been taken, and put ourselves on better legal footing delaying another 2 weeks at this point doesn't really make any difference, so I'd love to see this go back through committee and have a conversation in closed session with the state's attorney.
So we have a motion by Mr. Fellers to send this back to committee. And I think that's going to go back to what we talked about before, Mr. Kurlinkus.
The only thing I'd caution, and I don't have the calendar to see what this is, but I believe action has to be taken at a county board meeting within 30 days of the reconsiderations. So I don't know if you're going to be beyond that or not without looking at a calendar.
We did this with one that came through the operations committee and the same thing. I think we are taking action right now by the action is to send it back. That is still an action, whether it's not an up or down motion.
Yeah, I think you've got to act on the reconsideration. Again, I don't have it in front of me, but I think you have to take action. I don't think sending it back to committee is an action. I think, again, this is, as the chairman said, this is probably the same type of situation, up or down. But I know that the 30 days is in both your ordinance and the statute that you have to, that I think it has to be voted on. Again, I can look it up, but I don't have it in front of me. Maybe you can look it up on if you can look up on the county code.
And it doesn't say anything. It just says action. If you decide moving to committee is action, then that's action.
I would just jump in and say that I'm clear, I absolutely recall on an item that was reconsidered, it got sent back to committee, touched the committee, did come back to the board. I do know we have done that in more recent history, not referring to the December Costco reconsideration, but that was a more immediate issue. So if we did that one time, and again, that's only if the board wants to, that would take a yes, an affirmative vote to send that back to committee. A no vote would not send it back to committee, and it would keep the item before the board this evening. So if you are opposed to sending it back to committee, you could vote no on the motion to send it back to committee. So with that, we have an item before the board is to refer this back to committee. A yes vote, or I'm sorry, a yes. I'm sorry, is there?
There was no second.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Mrs. Crosby has a second. We have a motion and a second. Thank you, Mr. Schultz, to send this back to committee. A yes vote sends it back to committee. A no vote would keep it right here for potential action this evening. Mr. Fellers.
Thank you. And just to follow up, the point here is not to defeat this or try to slow it down, but to get legal advice in closed session from our state's attorney's office, given that actions have been taken, that there are updates to the court case, that we should simply protect ourselves from further legal liability. And again, a 2-week delay doesn't really change anything at this point.
Yes, Dave.
The number one, the action today in which the chairman was granted his ability to have his own attorney in the lawsuit regarding within the county, and then the other one, and again, I don't want to discuss personnel matters here in open session, but action was taken before the resolution. The ordinance changes that allowed this to happen were approved. The actual action to terminate was taken. I want to understand from the state's attorney's office what our legal liability is, because an individual took action without the state authority to do so. I think it would just be safe to have this conversation.
So motion and second to send this back to committee. The only thing I would add that I think would be okay, given the obvious, is just like we revisited our budget process when we got a new administrator in, and there were changes to that budget. There was a second set of eyes. There was a review of previous work committed and done prior. That was relooked at by Mr. Chapman as the new county administrator, and he made some suggestions that proved worthwhile to the board. That makes sense to me given a number of factors. I just wanted to put that on the record. Any other comments or questions? Again, a yes vote would send this back to committee. A no vote would keep that right here. Mrs. Crosby, and then, did you have your hand up, Mr. Salgado? You're next. Mrs. Crosby.
I do know that we're going to get sued over this, so the employee is no longer on site. And I agree with Mr. Fellers that we probably should get a legal opinion on where we stand on these things, and then, bring it back. It's going to eventually pass anyway, but I'm just looking at the legal liability of it, and I would like to know that prior to voting versus finding it out after the fact, because we are going to get sued.
We have a motion and a second. Thank you, Mr. Webster, on your point of order. We have a motion and a second to send this to committee. There was discussion that is involved several folks about whether or not to send it to committee or the relevancy of that discussion. Yes. Mr. Arena, or I'm sorry, I'm going to pull that back. Mr. Salgado, then Mr. Arena. My apologies.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't know. I think we've beat this one to death many times. I guess I'm just not understanding. Now it's just legal liability. We had those conversations, you know, here and there. You know, so I guess I'm not understanding why we want to send this back. I mean, we already voted on it. It got pushed back forward a couple times here and there. So I guess I'm just, you're right, 2 weeks is not going to do anything. So if we vote on it today, I just heard from Ms. Crosby, we're going to get sued regardless, right? So, I mean, whatever the liability, it could be $1, it could be $500,000, it could be $1 million. You know, it's just a number there from my perspective on that aspect of it. There was something done here. It's a personnel issue. I can't talk to the specifics. There was a recommendation, and I believe the board fully passed this through. And so it's a reconsideration again. And from my perspective, you know, based on the ordinance, we follow the process. Now, we can go into debate whether, you know, you're the plaintiff or the defense on whether, you know, the chairman's going to get the authority to override the county administrator, whatever. It's all speculation at this point in time. So we follow the process. We have the ordinance. It was done properly. There was no impropriety at this point in time done. We need to move on. Let's move on. Up and down. Let's move forward. Why send it back to committee for what, or back for reconsideration for what? To go in closed session. We've already made and talked about this. This is nothing new. This is nothing that has come out of the woodwork or anything like that. So let's move forward on this. This is ridiculous.
So there's a motion and a second to send this back to committee. Mr. Arena.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to echo what Mr. Salgado just said. We discussed this before, and we discussed liability and all the legalities of it. And I was comfortable with my decision the first time, and I'm not going to be changing my vote. But what we're talking about, going back and rehashing, has already been discussed. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Arena. Any other comments by board members? Follow up by Mr. Fellers.
Thank you. And just to clarify, Mr. Salgado, I'm not suggesting that we need to rehash this. The point is that an action was taken before this ordinance took effect. We need to clarify on this one. This board did pass this ordinance, but by our own ordinances, it's got 10 days to take effect, and the chairman has the ability to offer the reconsideration. Within 48 hours, an action was taken as if this ordinance had actually passed and had actually cleared and was now in effect. That is what I want to understand our legal liability on, because that changes the whole scenario, right? The person took action without the legal authority to do so. And that's what we need to discuss with the state's attorney's office before we move forward. All we're doing here is covering our butts. That's all I'm asking us to do.
Mrs. Squirrel. Thank you, Mr. Fellers. Mrs. Squirrel.
Thank you, Chairman. It's already too late. If Mrs. Crosby already knows that there's something in process, why are we going to go back and change things and make us look like fools when we did what we did because we felt at that time that was the most important thing? If this is happening, then it's probably already in process, so why change anything? Leave it the way it is. Thank you.
We have a motion by Mr. Webster. I don't think there's any other hands up, but we have a motion by Mr. Webster, second by Mr. Girl, to call the question. All those in favor of calling the question signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? We'll call the question, and we'll go ahead and ask the clerk to call the roll. A yes vote sends this to committee. A no vote keeps it right here, and then if there is a no vote, then we'll take a separate action to then pass or fail. Thank you. Again, yes vote sends it to committee, no vote keeps it right here.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Kelly?
No.
Mr. McDonald?
No.
Mr. Neighbors?
No.
Mrs. Red?
No.
Mr. Salgado?
No.
Mr. Schultz? Mr. Tassoni?
No.
Mr. Webster? Mr. Westcott? Mr. Arena?
No.
Mr. Billich?
No.
Mr. Booker?
No.
Mr. Boomer? Mrs. Crosby?
Yes.
Mr. Fellers?
Yes.
Mr. Fiducia?
No.
Mr. Gurl?
No.
Mrs. Gorel? Mr. Hoffman?
I recuse.
Motion to send to committee fails. That'll keep the item on the board floor and in front of the board, which is the reconsideration. A yes vote on the reconsideration passes it a second time. A no vote would deny this from being passed. Any other quick questions or comments before I ask the clerk to take the roll on that as well? Seeing none, I'll ask the clerk to take a roll. And again, a yes vote would pass this item, then again the second time. A no vote would deny it.
Mr. McDonald?
Yes.
Mr. Neighbors?
Yes.
Mrs. Red? Mr. Salgado?
Yes.
Mr. Schultz?
Yes.
Mr. Tassoni?
Yes.
Mr. Webster? Mr. Westcott?
Yes.
Mr. Arena?
Yes.
Mr. Billich? Mr. Booker?
No.
Mr. Boomer? Mr. Butita is absent. Mrs. Crosby?
Yes.
Mr. Fellers?
No.
Mr. Fiducia?
Yes.
Mr. Gurl?
Yes.
Mrs. Gorel? Mr. Hoffman?
Recuse.
Mr. Kelly?
No.
Mrs. Crosby? Did you change your vote to no?
Okay. Reconsideration passes, and we'll take. Oh, I'm sorry.
Red?
Did we miss Mrs. Red? She's a yes vote.
She's a yes vote. Thank you, Mrs. Red.
Thank you, Mrs. Red. Any other? We got everybody else. Motion passes, so the reconsideration passes. Thank you very much for the discussion. Mr. Fiducia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We have animal stories. This should only take about 20 minutes. We've had 834 calls for service. 549 were from the city of Rockford. 54 were from McChesney. 67 Loves Park, Rockton 12, Roscoe 16, Village of Winnebago 4, Cherry Valley 4, and unincorporated Winnebago County 104. There's 168 dogs in custody and 302 cats, 4 chickens, 10 guinea pigs, and 2 rabbits. So anybody that wants a chicken or a guinea pig, stop out to the Animal Services and we can work that out for you. And that would conclude my report.
Thank you very much. There's no mention of an alligator that went viral. Oh. Okay. Yes, Mr. Boomer.
Vote to adjourn.
So we have a motion, a second to adjourn, which would sidestep unfinished business and new business. Is that something that can be motioned and seconded that far up in the agenda? So, other, thank you very much, Mr. Erlinkus. Point of order, Mr. Gurl.
Thank you, Chairman. Robert Rules of Order, once a motion is, and I'm asking, once a motion is made to adjourn and it is second, is that meeting then adjourned in Robert's Rules of Order?
No.
It needs to be voted on. So a second doesn't automatically adjourn? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
But would it, that,
No. There was a point of order after the second. The point of order raised the question of the legitimacy of sidestepping items 14 and 15 and adjourning immediately. And after consulting with the state's attorney, who suggested that we would be best served by continuing with the agenda till the end, then that's what we'll do. Unfinished business, I can touch quickly. There is a update on the casino. There was a public hearings on the 3 casino options. My understanding is they're going to narrow it and drop one of the options sometime in the next week. And then we'll have, I believe in October, a recommendation that will go to City Council, then the state of Illinois. That's been in the media quite a bit. I will skip over a few of these except to say I do know there's discussion going on internally with the trustee program. I am getting a lot of questions regarding when this is going to be going back to committee, and am very concerned because this has gone on and on and on. And I am, we talk about respect. When there's discussions between board members and the state's attorney's office about how to not involve me in the process, all I'm saying is I want to be part of the discussion on something that's a state statute responsibility of the chairman. And so I welcome that outreach from whoever is involved to be part of that discussion. We do need to get this piece of business back to committee and to the board. I believe if it came to the board tonight, it would pass. The community is clamoring for it, and we got to get going here on that. Is there, one question I do have is there a next meeting scheduled for 911 with the coalition? Mr. Boomer?
You probably have to ask Gino Galuzzo on that one because he's, right, Mr. Klinkus? Gino hasn't responded to your last email, right?
Is there an update on the 911? Is there a meeting coming?
We've not set a meeting up with the coalition. I've had several telephone discussions with Mr. Galuzzo regarding his proposed changes to our IGA draft that we sent to him. We currently do not have another meeting set.
Okay, thank you. Is there any update on the animal services contract with the city?
We had a discussion, I don't know if Mr. Chapman probably has the figures on that. I talked to Mr. Chapman about it. I know it is on the agenda for the city council on Monday.
So the contract's going to the city council. Will it be coming to the county board in the near future? Mr. Chapman?
I would presume so, yes.
Okay, so the animal services contract is going to be coming to committee here in the near future. It's going to the city then next week. Moving on to new business, we do have a number of appointments to read in. There are 5, all related to the Winnebago County Housing Authority Board. It's a 5-year term. This is in for first reading. Reappointment of Tasha Reddick, the resident coordinator. Reappointment of Alana Conrad to the board. Reappointment of Ron Ballard. A new appointment of Scott Anderson that would replace Jim Hughes, who resigned from the board at the end of his term. And new appointment of Mustafa Abdal to replace Fred Westcott, board member Fred Westcott, who is completing his term as well. So those are in for first reading. And with that, I believe there was a motion to adjourn that we can accept at this time. Is there a motion to adjourn? Motion by Mr. Fellers, second by Mrs. Crosby and Mr. Gurl. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? Have a good night.